Sometimes the truth doesn't knock, it just walks in wearing your face. The bell above the cafe door chimed once, soft and forgettable, the kind of sound that disappeared into the low hum of espresso machines and quiet morning conversations. But something about that single note felt different, like the room itself had paused for a fraction of a second before continuing. And Ethan Cole noticed it, even if he couldn't explain why. He stepped inside with the same measured confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations, his charcoal suit tailored to precision, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that caught the soft golden light spilling through the front windows. And for a moment, the world outside, the traffic, the calls waiting on his phone, the weight of decisions stacked neatly on his shoulders, faded behind the warmth of roasted coffee and quiet routine. This place wasn't on his calendar. It never was. Yet his feet had brought him here without permission, guided by something he refused to name. He scanned the room out. Of habit, quick, efficient, a man used to reading environments in seconds. But then his gaze slowed, caught on a figure behind the counter, and everything else blurred. Maya Brooks stood there, her posture straight, movements calm and deliberate as she wiped down the espresso bar, her dark curls pulled back loosely, a few strands catching the light, her expression composed in a way that didn't ask for attention and didn't need it. And for a second Ethan thought he had made a mistake, that his memory was playing tricks on him, that the past couldn't just stand there like it belonged in the present. But she didn't disappear, didn't look away, didn't pretend not to see him. Their eyes met, and instead of surprise, instead of shock, there was something steadier in hers, something that felt like she had already lived this moment 100 times before it ever happened. Ethan's breath slowed, not out of calm, but control, the kind he had mastered over years of never letting anything show before he decided it should. And he took a step forward, then another, each one quieter than the last, as if the space between them carried more weight than it should. Maya, he said, her name leaving his mouth with a familiarity that didn't belong to the distance between who they were. Now, and she didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't offer anything beyond a simple, grounded acknowledgement. Ethan, her voice even, unshaken, like she wasn't standing across from a man whose name appeared in magazines and headlines, like he wasn't the one who had once walked out of her life without looking back. The espresso machine hissed behind her, a burst of steam cutting through the silence that settled too quickly. And for a second it felt like the cafe had narrowed, like every table, every chair, every quiet conversation had stepped back to give space to something neither of them had planned to face. Ethan's mind moved faster than the moment, flipping through memory, searching for context, for explanation, for control. But before he could form the next word, before he could decide how this conversation would unfold, a small voice broke through the air, light and clear and completely unaware of the tension it had just stepped into. Mommy. The word landed softly, but it changed everything. Ethan turned his head, almost instinctively, drawn by the sound more than the meaning. And that's when he saw her. The little girl stepped out from behind the counter, one hand brushing against the edge of the wooden surface as if she had done it 1,000 times, her steps small but certain, her presence quiet but impossible to ignore. And the world didn't stop, not really, but it felt like it did, like every sound in the room pulled back just enough to leave space for what Ethan was seeing. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, maybe 5, her light brown skin glowing under the soft morning light, her curls pulled into 2 neat puffs that framed her face, her eyes wide and curious as they lifted toward Maya, and then, slowly, toward him. Ethan didn't realize he had stopped breathing until his chest tightened, until the air in the room felt heavier than it should, until something deep and unsteady shifted beneath the surface of everything he thought he understood. It wasn't just that she looked familiar. It wasn't the vague recognition people sometimes felt when they saw a stranger who reminded them of someone else. It was sharper than that, clearer, undeniable in a way that didn't ask for confirmation. Her eyes, his eyes, the exact same shape, the same slight narrowing at the corners as if the world was something to be studied before trusted, the same quiet intensity that people had once described as intimidating when he was a child. Her nose, the subtle curve he had seen every morning in the mirror for decades. Even the way she tilted her head, just slightly, as if adjusting to a question she hadn't fully formed yet. It was all there. Not similar, not close, but exact. Ethan's mind rejected it before it could accept it, logic stepping in where emotion threatened to take over. Calculating timelines, probabilities, anything that could dismantle what he was seeing. But the more he looked, the less those calculations held. The girl's gaze met his fully now, unafraid, curious in the way children are when they sense something different but don't yet understand why. And something in that directness hit harder than anything else. Maya didn't move to interrupt, didn't step in front of her, didn't explain. And that absence of reaction said more than any words could have. Ethan finally exhaled, slow, controlled, but it didn't steady him the way it usually did. "Who is she?" he asked, the question sounding more distant than he intended, like it had traveled through too many layers of thought before reaching the surface. Maya glanced down at the girl, her expression softening just slightly, a shift so subtle it could have been missed if someone wasn't looking for it. Then back at him. "This is Lila," she said, her voice calm, grounded, the kind of tone that didn't invite interruption. Ethan nodded once, as if acknowledging a simple fact, but nothing about this felt simple. His eyes moved back to the child. "Lila." And the resemblance hit again, harder this time, not as a realization but as a certainty. He took a step closer before he realized he was moving, his focus narrowing, the rest of the cafe dissolving into background noise that no longer mattered. "That's not," he started, then stopped, the sentence collapsing under its own weight because there was no version of it that made sense anymore. Maya watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with a quiet steadiness that felt like it had been built over time, piece by piece, in moments he hadn't been there to witness. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight in a way he couldn't remember feeling before, and forced the words out, quieter now, stripped of the control he usually carried so easily. "Tell me that's not mine." The air between them didn't break, didn't shift, it just held, heavy and still, as if the answer had already been given long before he asked. Maya didn't rush, didn't soften it, didn't wrap it in anything meant to make it easier. She met his gaze directly, her voice steady, unshaken. "You walked away before you knew." And just like that, the world Ethan had spent years building, structured, controlled, predictable, tilted, not with noise or chaos, but with something far quieter, far more final, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one deciding what came next. The silence did not break after her words. It settled deeper, pressing into the space between them like something permanent, and Ethan Cole stood there with his hand still slightly raised, as if he had been about to say something else, something that belonged to the version of himself that always had an answer. But that version did not show up this time. Lila shifted closer to Maya, her small fingers curling lightly around the edge of her mother's apron, her eyes still on Ethan with that same unfiltered curiosity, and the weight of that gaze made it impossible for him to look away even when every instinct told him to regain control of the moment. He had faced negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars without hesitation, had made decisions that affected entire companies without a flicker of doubt, but none of that translated here. Not in a quiet cafe on an ordinary morning where a single sentence had just rewritten something he did not know existed. "How old is she?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, steadier in tone but not in meaning. And Maya did not answer right away, not because she was searching for the words, but because she did not rush to give him anything he had not earned. "4," she said after a beat, and the number landed harder than it should have, because Ethan did the math before he could stop himself, counting backward with the same precision he used in every other part of his life. And the timeline aligned too cleanly, too perfectly with a memory he had filed away as insignificant, a single night in a city he barely remembered visiting, a moment he had never thought would carry forward into anything real. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in the effort to hold himself together as the pieces began to shift. "You should have told me," he said, the statement coming out sharper than he intended, and for the first time since he walked in, something in Maya's expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it. She straightened just a fraction, her shoulders settling into a posture that carried both calm and finality. "You made it very clear you were not someone who stayed," she replied, her voice still even, still controlled. but carrying a weight that did not need volume to be understood. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a quiet release of tension that did nothing to ease the pressure building inside his chest. "That does not mean I would have walked away from this," he said, gesturing slightly toward Lila before stopping himself. As if the motion alone required permission he did not have. Maya's gaze followed the movement, then returned to him, steady and unyielding. "You already did," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no raised tone, just a simple truth stated without decoration, the kind that left no room for argument because it did not need one. Lila looked up at her mother, then back at Ethan, her small brow furrowing slightly as if she could sense the shift in the air even if she could not understand it. "Mommy, who is he?" she asked softly, and the question hung there, light and innocent, cutting through everything else with a clarity neither adult could match. Maya glanced down at her, her expression softening again in a way that felt completely separate from the conversation unfolding above her daughter's head. "He is someone I used to know," she said gently, her tone warm in a way it had not been with Ethan, and something about that distinction landed deeper than any direct statement could have. Ethan felt it, the distance in those words, the way they reduced him from presence to past, from possibility to something already closed. He swallowed, his throat dry, and forced himself to stay where he was instead of stepping forward again. "Used to know," he repeated quietly, more to himself than to her, as if testing how the phrase felt when spoken aloud. Lila tilted her head slightly, studying him with a focus that mirrored his own earlier gaze. And for a moment he saw himself again, not in a mirror, not in a reflection, but in a living, breathing presence that existed independently of him. "You look funny," she said suddenly, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity rather than judgment. And Maya let out the faintest breath that might have been the beginning of a smile before she caught it, grounding herself again. Ethan blinked, caught off guard in a way he had not been in years. And for a second the tension eased just enough for something else to slip through. Something almost human, almost simple. "Funny how?" he asked, his tone softer now, instinctively adjusting to meet her level. Lila shrugged slightly, her curls bouncing with the movement. "Like me," she said, and the words, so small and unguarded, landed with more force than anything else that had been said so far. Ethan's chest tightened again, sharper this time, because there was no calculation, no denial, no strategy that could counter something that clear. Maya placed a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder, not to pull her away but to steady the moment before it shifted too far. "We have to get back to work," she said quietly, her attention returning to Ethan just long enough to make the boundary clear. "This is not a conversation for here," she added, and there was something deliberate in the way she said it. Not an invitation, not a refusal, but a line drawn with intention. Ethan nodded slowly, recognizing the control in her tone, the same kind he had always respected in others, even when it worked against him. "Then tell me where," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual steadiness, not as a demand, but as a request he was not used to making. Maya held his gaze for a moment longer, measuring something he could not see, then reached for a small notepad near the register, her movements calm and precise as she wrote down an address, the pen gliding across the paper without hesitation. She tore the sheet cleanly and placed it on the counter between them, not sliding it toward him, not pushing it away, simply leaving it there for him to take or ignore. 7 o'clock, she said, her tone final, and then she turned, guiding Lila gently back behind the counter, her focus shifting fully to the tasks waiting for her, as if the moment had already passed. Ethan stood there for a second longer, the piece of paper resting untouched in front of him, the low hum of the cafe returning to its normal rhythm around him as conversations resumed and cups clinked softly against saucers. He reached for the note finally, his fingers closing around it with a steadiness he did not feel, and glanced down at the address, committing it to memory in an instant the way he always did. But this time it did not feel like preparation. It felt like stepping into something unknown. When he looked up again, Maya was already moving through the space with quiet efficiency, Lila beside her, the two of them existing in a rhythm that did not include him, and for the first time in a long time. Ethan Cole understood what it felt like to be outside of something that mattered, standing at the edge of a life that had continued. without him, and realizing that if he wanted any part of it now, he would have to earn it from the beginning. By the time Ethan Cole stepped out of the cafe, the morning air felt different, sharper somehow, like the world had shifted just enough to make everything unfamiliar. And for a man who built his life on certainty, that feeling did not sit well. The city moved the same way it always did, cars passing in steady lines, people crossing streets with coffee cups in hand, conversations blending into a low, constant rhythm. But none of it reached him the way it usually did, because his mind was somewhere else, replaying a single image over and over again. The curve of a small face, the way those eyes had met his without hesitation, the simple sentence that had carried more truth than anything he had heard in years. He reached his car without remembering the steps it took to get there, his hand pausing on the door handle for a fraction longer than necessary before he pulled it open and slid into the driver's seat. The familiar scent of leather and quiet control surrounding him, but it did not ground him the way it usually did. He sat there for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if the answer to something might appear if he just held still long enough. But the only thing that came back to him was her voice, calm and steady. "You walked away before you knew." And the words did not accuse, did not demand. They simply existed, and that made them harder to ignore. Ethan exhaled slowly, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the folded piece of paper Maya had left on the counter, smoothing it out with careful fingers as his eyes scanned the address again, committing it deeper into memory even though he had already done that once. The numbers and street names settling into his mind with the same precision he used for contracts and data, but this felt different, less like information and more like a path he could not turn away from. He glanced at the time on the dashboard, the digital numbers steady and indifferent, and calculated the hours between now and 7 o'clock without thinking, but instead of filling that time with meetings or calls the way he normally would, he sat there, still, letting the weight of what had just happened settle fully. His phone buzzed once in the center console, then again, notifications stacking quietly, reminders of the world he controlled waiting for him to step back into it, but he did not reach for it right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a brief moment, not to rest, but to focus, to try and reconstruct the memory he had dismissed years ago, the night that now refused to stay buried. It came back in fragments at first, a hotel room with dim lighting, the distant sound of traffic filtering through thick windows, a conversation that had started casual and stayed that way. No promises, no expectations, just two people sharing space for a moment that neither of them had planned to carry forward. And that had been enough for him at the time, more than enough to justify leaving without looking back, because his life had always been moving forward, never pausing long enough to consider what might be left behind. But now, that same memory felt incomplete, like a story he had stopped reading before it reached the part that mattered. His eyes opened again, focusing on the street ahead, and he realized something that unsettled him more than anything else. Not that he had made a mistake, but that he had never considered the possibility that there had been something more to it at all. He started the engine, the low hum filling the quiet space around him, and pulled into traffic with automatic precision, his hands steady even as his thoughts were not. The drive to his office passed in a blur, familiar streets and buildings sliding by without registering, because every time his mind tried to return to routine, it circled back to the same place, the same face, the same question that no longer felt like a question at all. When he finally stepped into the glass tower that housed his company, everything looked exactly as it should: polished floors, controlled lighting, employees moving with purpose, the environment he had built piece by piece over years of discipline and focus. And yet for the first time, it felt slightly disconnected from him, like he was walking through something he owned but was not fully inside. "Good morning, sir," his assistant greeted him as he approached, her tone professional and warm, the same as every other day, but Ethan only nodded in response, his attention already shifting past the surface of routine. "Clear my afternoon," he said without breaking stride, his voice calm, decisive, and she paused just slightly, not out of confusion, but because that was not something he said lightly. "All of it?" she asked carefully, and he did not slow, did not reconsider. "All of it," he confirmed. And the simplicity of the instruction carried more weight than the words themselves. Inside his office, The city stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a skyline he had once looked at with certainty, every building a marker of progress, every street a path he had already mapped in his mind. But today it felt different, not smaller, not less significant, just incomplete in a way he could not fully define. He set his keys down on the desk with quiet precision and remained standing for a moment, his reflection faint in the glass in front of him. A man who looked exactly the same as he had that morning, composed, controlled, unchanged on the surface, but carrying something entirely new beneath it. He reached for his phone then, scrolling through the notifications with quick efficiency, returning calls, sending short, direct responses, handling everything that required his attention with the same discipline he always had. But there was a distance in it now, a part of his focus held elsewhere, anchored to a small cafe, and a child who had changed the trajectory of his day with a single glance. Hours passed, measured not by meetings or outcomes, but by the steady movement of time towards 7 o'clock, and as the afternoon light began to soften against the glass, Ethan found himself standing again, the folded piece of paper in his hand, the address. No longer just information, but a destination he had already committed to before he allowed himself to fully understand what it meant. He left the office earlier than anyone expected, the quiet surprise in the glances that followed him out something he did not acknowledge, because for the first time in a long time, there was something more important than being seen in control. The city outside had shifted into evening, the light warmer, the pace slightly slower, and as he drove toward the address Maya had given him, each turn brought a subtle tension he did not try to suppress, because this was not a situation he could manage from a distance, not a variable he could adjust until it fit into his world. This required something else, something he had not had to offer in years, if ever. When he finally turned onto the street, the environment changed, quieter, more residential, lined with modest homes and soft porch lights beginning to flicker on as the sun dipped lower, and he slowed the car without thinking, his eyes scanning the numbers until they matched the one on the paper. He parked along the curb, the engine going still as the silence settled around him again. But this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, just waiting. Ethan sat there for a moment, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his gaze fixed on the small house in front of him, and for the first time since that morning, he allowed himself to acknowledge the full weight of what he was about to step into, not as a problem to solve, not as a situation to control, but as a reality that existed whether he was ready for it or not. And as he reached for the door handle, there was no hesitation left, only the understanding that whatever happened next would not be decided by him alone. The quiet of the street wrapped around Ethan as he stepped out of the car, the soft click of the door closing behind him sounding louder than it should have in the stillness of early evening. And for a moment he remained there, standing beside the curb with his gaze fixed on the small house ahead, its warm porch light casting a gentle glow across the front steps, the kind of place that did not demand attention but held its own quiet presence, steady and grounded in a way that felt unfamiliar to him. The air carried a faint hint of cut grass and distant conversation from neighboring homes, the ordinary rhythm of a life lived without headlines or boardrooms. And as he took a step forward, then another, the distance between where he stood and where he was going felt heavier than it should have, not because of the space itself, but because of what waited on the other side. He reached the walkway, the sound of his shoes against the concrete measured and deliberate, each step carrying him closer to something he could not predict. And when he finally stopped at the front door, his hand hovered just slightly before lifting to knock, not out of hesitation, but because for once he understood that this was not a moment he could control by moving faster. His knuckles met the wood in a firm, even rhythm, the sound echoing softly inside, followed by a brief silence that stretched just long enough to make him aware of his own breathing, steady but deeper than usual, and then footsteps approached, light but certain, and the door opened. Maya stood there, framed by the warm light behind her, no longer in the cafe uniform, but in something simple and comfortable, her presence unchanged in the way that mattered, calm, composed, and entirely aware of what this moment represented. For a second neither of them spoke, the quiet between them not awkward, not strained, just present, like a space that needed to exist before anything else could be said. "You came," she said finally, her voice even, not surprised, not welcoming, simply acknowledging what was already in front of her. "You gave me a time," Ethan replied, his tone steady, meeting her gaze directly, and there was something different in the way he held himself now, less guarded, not in posture but in intention. Maya studied him for a brief moment, as if measuring something beyond what he said, then stepped aside just enough to allow space. "Come in," she said, and the simplicity of the invitation carried more weight than any formal exchange could have. Ethan stepped across the threshold, the shift from the cool evening air to the warmth inside immediate but subtle, and he found himself in a living room that reflected a life built carefully, not with excess, not with display, but with intention, soft lighting, a couch that showed signs of use rather than decoration, a small bookshelf lined with both adult titles and children's stories, and on one wall, a series of framed drawings, colorful and imperfect in the way only a child's work could be, each one placed with care rather than convenience. His eyes moved over the space quickly, not out of habit this time, but because he was trying to understand something he had never been part of, and before he could take another step, a familiar voice reached him from the hallway. "Mommy." Lila appeared a second later, her small feet padding softly against the floor, her curls slightly loosened from the day, her eyes bright with curiosity that had not faded since the morning. And when she saw Ethan standing there, she paused, not in fear, not in hesitation, just in recognition. "You came back," she said, the statement simple, direct, as if it were the most natural conclusion to the earlier encounter. And Ethan felt something shift again, quieter this time, but no less significant. Because there was no expectation in her tone, just observation. "I said I would," he replied, his voice softer than it had been before, not because he was trying to be, but because the environment did not call for anything else. Lila nodded once, as if that settled something for her, then looked up at Maya briefly before stepping a little closer, her attention returning to Ethan with that same steady curiosity. Maya watched the interaction without interrupting, her presence a constant anchor in the room, and after a moment, she gestured toward the couch. "Sit," she said, and Ethan did, lowering himself into the space with a controlled movement that felt almost unfamiliar outside of a conference setting, his posture straight but not rigid, his hands resting loosely in front of him as he waited. Maya remained standing for a second longer, then moved to sit across from him, the distance between them deliberate, not distant but defined, while Lila settled onto the floor nearby with a small toy she had brought from the hallway, her attention shifting between play and observation in the way children naturally do. The room settled into a quiet rhythm again, one that did not rush the conversation but did not avoid it either, and Ethan understood that whatever was said next needed to come without the structure he usually relied on. "I want to understand," he said finally, the words simple but carrying more intention than any prepared statement could have, and Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "Then listen," she replied, her tone steady, not instructive, not defensive, just clear. Ethan nodded once, a small acknowledgement that held more weight than it appeared, and for the first time since he had stepped into this situation, he did not try to lead, did not try to direct the conversation toward a conclusion he could control. Maya took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to begin. "After that night, I did not expect anything," she said, her voice even, her eyes steady on his. "I did not look for you. I did not try to reach out, because there was nothing in the way you left that suggested you would stay. And there was no bitterness in the words, no sharp edge, just a clear recounting of what had been." Ethan listened without interrupting, the instinct to respond held back by something stronger, the understanding that this was not about defending himself. "When I found out I was pregnant, I made a decision," she continued, her gaze flicking briefly toward Lila before returning, "not based on you, but on what I knew I could do." And there was a quiet strength in that statement, one that did not need elaboration. Ethan's eyes followed the same brief movement toward the child, then back to Maya, and for a moment he saw the timeline not as numbers, but as moments he had not been present for, steps taken without him, choices made without his input, and the realization settled in a way that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. "You never told her about me," he said, not as an accusation but as an observation, and Maya shook her head slightly. There was nothing to tell, she replied, her tone unchanged. I do not build stories on maybes. And the simplicity of that answer left no space for interpretation. Lila looked up then, sensing her name even if it had not been spoken directly, her eyes moving between them with quiet interest, and Ethan felt the weight of that again. Not as pressure, but as responsibility he had not chosen but could not ignore. And now? He asked, the question softer, less certain than anything he had asked before, and Maya held his gaze for a moment longer, the silence stretching just enough to make the answer matter. Now you know, she said, and there was something final in it, not closing the door, but making it clear that what came next would not be decided by words alone. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing that, not pushing against it, not trying to reshape it, just allowing it to exist as it was, and for the first time in a long time, he did not reach for control, because sitting there, in a room filled with quiet evidence of a life he had not been part of, he understood that control was not what this required, and whatever came next would have to be built on something entirely different. The room did not rush forward after her words. It settled deeper into itself, as if everything that needed to be said had already been placed on the table, and now it was waiting to see what would be done with it. And Ethan sat there with his gaze steady but quieter than before, not searching for an angle, not calculating a response, just absorbing the shape of a reality that had formed without him. Lila's soft humming filled the edges of the silence as she moved a small toy car back and forth across the wooden floor, the wheels making a gentle rhythm that somehow grounded the moment more than anything else could have. And Ethan found himself watching her again, not with the shock that had hit him earlier, but with something more focused, more deliberate, as if he were trying to understand not just what she looked like, but who she was. The way she leaned slightly to one side when she concentrated, the quiet determination in her movements, the absence of hesitation in the way she existed in her own space. All of it spoke of a life that had been stable, consistent, built with care, and that realization carried its own weight, because it meant that whatever he was feeling now had not been necessary for her to become who she already was. Does she know anything about where she comes from? He asked after a moment, his voice measured, careful not to disrupt the balance that had formed in the room, and Maya's eyes moved to him, steady and clear. She knows she is loved, she knows she is safe, and she knows she is mine, she said, each part of the sentence placed with intention, and there was no defensiveness in it, no need to justify, just a clear statement of what mattered. Ethan nodded slowly, the simplicity of that answer settling into him in a way that was harder to process than a complicated explanation would have been, because it left no room for him to insert himself into the narrative that had already been built. And me? He asked, the question quieter now, less about position and more about truth, and Maya held his gaze for a moment longer before answering. You are a fact, she said, her tone unchanged, not a presence. And the distinction landed with a precision that did not need emphasis. Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands coming together loosely as he considered that, not resisting it, not arguing, just letting it exist as it was, because for the first time he understood that this was not about what he believed he should be, it was about what he had not been. Lila looked up again then, her attention drawn back to the conversation, as if she could sense the shift in tone even without understanding the words, and she pushed herself up from the floor, walking over with small, steady steps until she stood a few feet in front of Ethan, her head tilted slightly as she studied him again. Why do you look at me like that? She asked, her voice open, curious in a way that carried no fear, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not sharply this time, but steadily, like something settling into place. He did not answer immediately, not because he did not have words, but because he wanted to choose them carefully, aware now that this was not a space for assumptions or shortcuts. Because I am trying to understand something important, he said finally, his tone soft but clear, and Lila considered that for a second, then nodded as if that made sense to her in the way simple truths often do. Are you going to come back again? She asked next, the question direct, unfiltered, and it shifted the air in the room in a way neither adult could ignore. Ethan glanced briefly at Maya, not for permission, but for awareness, and she met his look without interruption, her expression neutral but attentive. Then he returned his focus to Lila. "I would like to," he said. The words honest, not promised, not exaggerated, just stated, and Lila seemed to accept that, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she gave a small nod. "Okay," she said, as if that settled something for her, and she turned back toward her toys. The conversation complete on her end in a way that only children could manage. The quiet returned again, but it felt different now, less heavy, more defined, as if something had shifted into place even if nothing had been resolved yet. Ethan watched her for a moment longer before looking back at Maya, and there was a change in his expression now, subtle but clear, not in confidence, but in intention. "I am not here to take anything from you," he said, his voice steady, the words chosen without calculation. "And I am not here to disrupt what you have built." And Maya listened without reacting, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, allowing him to continue without interruption. "But I am not going to walk away from this again," he added, and there was no force in it, no demand, just a quiet commitment that did not ask to be believed, only stated. Maya's eyes held his for a moment longer, searching not for the words themselves, but for what stood behind them, and when she spoke, her tone remained calm, but there was a slight shift, something more defined in the way she placed her response. "Wanting to stay and knowing how to stay are not the same thing," she said, and the truth in that did not challenge him. It grounded the moment in a way that made it real. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging it without resistance, because he understood now that this was not something that could be decided in a single conversation, not something that could be negotiated or resolved through logic alone. "Then I will learn," he said, the words simple, not presented as a solution, but as a starting point, and Maya did not respond immediately, her gaze moving briefly toward Lila, then back to him, as if measuring not the statement, but the space it would require. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking time, in a way that felt more noticeable now, and outside, the last light of the evening had shifted into a deeper shade, the house settling into its nighttime rhythm. Ethan glanced around the room once more, not with the detached observation he had used earlier, but with a quieter awareness, taking in the small details that spoke of consistency, of care, of a life that had not needed him to be complete. And that understanding did not push him away, it anchored him in a way he had not expected. "I will not rush this," he said after a moment, more to the space than to her. But she heard it, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not promise anything, but did not close the door either. Lila's laughter rose softly from the floor as she rolled her toy across the wood again, the sound light and unguarded, and Ethan felt something shift again, quieter than before, but steadier, like a foundation beginning to form where there had only been uncertainty. He stood slowly then, not as a retreat, but as a pause, his gaze meeting Maya's one more time. And in that look there was no attempt to claim, no effort to define, just a clear understanding that whatever this would become, it would not be built on control, but on something he was only beginning to learn how to offer. The night had settled fully by the time Ethan stepped back outside, the soft hum of the neighborhood replacing the quiet warmth of the house behind him. And for a moment he did not move, standing on the porch with his hand resting lightly against the railing, as if grounding himself in something steady before taking another step forward. The door closed gently behind him, not abrupt, not final, just a soft click that marked the end of that moment, without closing what it had opened, and he exhaled slowly, the cool evening air filling his lungs in a way that felt sharper now, more present. The street was calm, lit by scattered porch lights and the occasional passing car, and as he walked back toward where he had parked, his pace was slower than before, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing left to rush toward, no immediate solution waiting at the end of his steps. His mind did not race the way it usually did after a major decision or unexpected turn. It moved differently now, replaying not just the words that had been spoken, but the spaces between them, the way Maya had held her ground without resistance, the way Lila had accepted his presence without expectation, and the realization settled deeper with each step that what he had walked into was not something broken that needed fixing. It was something whole that he had simply not been part of. He reached his car and paused again, his hand resting briefly on the roof before he opened the door, the familiar structure of his world waiting inside. but for the first time it felt like just one part of something larger rather than the center of everything. He drove without turning on the radio, the quiet filling the space in a way that allowed his thoughts to settle rather than scatter. The city lights passing in long stretches of reflection across the windshield as he moved back toward the part of his life he knew how to navigate. When he arrived at his building, the glass doors reflected his image back at him, unchanged on the surface, composed, controlled, the same man who had walked out that morning. But there was a shift beneath it now, something less defined but more real, and as he stepped inside, the familiar greetings and nods followed him, the structure of his environment reasserting itself with quiet efficiency. "You left early," his assistant noted when he passed her desk the next morning, her tone professional but curious in the way it always was when something broke routine, and Ethan nodded once, not offering explanation because he did not have one that fit into the language of schedules and meetings. "I will be in," he said simply, and continued into his office, the door closing behind him with a soft click that separated the outside world from the one he controlled. The morning unfolded with its usual precision, calls answered, decisions made, numbers reviewed, and for a few hours it almost felt the same, the rhythm of his work steady and familiar. But there was a difference now, subtle but persistent, a part of his attention anchored elsewhere, not distracting, but present, like a second layer of awareness that did not fade. At one point, he found himself staring at a report longer than necessary, the lines of data clear but not holding his focus. And without thinking, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded piece of paper again. Though he no longer needed to read it, the address already fixed in his mind, and he realized it was not the location he was holding on to. It was what it represented, a place that existed outside of everything he had built, a place where he did not define the terms. He set the paper down on his desk, smoothing it out once more before placing it beside his phone, not hidden, not tucked away, just there, visible. And that small act carried more intention than he would have admitted. The hours passed, measured by tasks completed and conversations concluded, but as the afternoon light shifted again, he found himself making a decision that did not follow his usual process, not calculated, not weighed against outcomes, just clear in a way that did not require justification. He stood, reached for his coat, and paused only long enough to leave a brief instruction with his assistant that he would be unavailable for the rest of the day. And there was a flicker of surprise in her expression, quickly replaced by understanding, because even without details, she recognized that something had shifted. The drive back felt different this time, not unfamiliar, but more intentional, each turn made with awareness rather than momentum. And as he pulled onto the same quiet street, the repetition of the path did not lessen its impact. It deepened it, reinforcing the understanding that this was not a one-time interruption, but the beginning of something that would require consistency. He parked in the same spot, the engine settling into silence once again, and this time he did not sit for long, did not hesitate at the threshold of the moment. He stepped out, walked to the door, and knocked with the same steady rhythm as before. The door opened sooner this time, and Lila stood there, her small hand still on the handle as she looked up at him with immediate recognition, her expression brightening in a way that was simple and unguarded. "You came back," she said again. But this time there was a hint of expectation in it, not demand, not reliance, just a small shift that acknowledged pattern. Ethan allowed a faint smile to touch his expression, not forced, not practiced, just there. "I said I would," he replied, and the words carried a little more weight now because they had been followed through. Maya appeared behind her, her gaze moving from Lila to Ethan, taking in the moment without interrupting it. And for a second there was something different in her eyes, not surprise, not approval, just recognition that this was not a single decision, it was a continuation. "We were about to have dinner," she said, her tone neutral but open, and Ethan nodded. "Once, I do not want to interrupt," he said, and she shook her head slightly. "You are already here," she replied, stepping aside again, and the invitation felt different this time, less like a test, more like a boundary that had shifted just enough to allow space. Ethan stepped inside once more, the warmth of the house greeting him again. But now it felt less like an environment he was entering and more like one he was beginning to understand. And as he moved further into the room, the sound of dishes being set on the table, the quiet rhythm of a life continuing without pause. He realized that this was not about fitting into something perfectly. It was about showing up consistently enough that a place could be made, not given, not assumed, but earned in the quiet, steady way that Maya had built everything he now saw around him. The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around Ethan in a way that felt quieter than the rest of the house, more intimate, not because of the space itself, but because of what it held. A small table set with 3 plates, simple utensils placed with care, a pitcher of water catching the soft light from above, and for a moment he stood just inside the doorway, taking it in without moving forward, aware that this was not a setting he could step into the same way he entered a boardroom or a deal. This was something lived in, something built over time with consistency rather than control. Lila climbed into her chair without hesitation, her small movements practiced, familiar, as if every part of this routine had been repeated enough times to become second nature, and Maya moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency. Placing a dish at the center of the table, her focus steady, her presence grounded in a way that did not shift just because he was there. "You can sit," she said, not looking up immediately, her tone neutral, but the words carried the same quiet permission as before, and Ethan stepped forward, pulling out the chair opposite Lila, his movements measured, aware now that even the smallest actions held weight in a space like this. He sat, his hands resting lightly near the edge of the table, not reaching for anything yet, not assuming, just present. The room settled into a different kind of silence, not empty, not tense, but filled with the soft sounds of plates being adjusted, water being poured, Lila's quiet humming as she shifted in her seat. And Ethan realized that this kind of quiet was not something he was used to. It did not demand attention. It did not require performance. It simply existed. Maya took her seat last, her posture relaxed but attentive, and for a moment none of them spoke. The rhythm of the meal beginning without the need for introduction. Lila reached for a piece of bread, breaking it carefully, her small fingers focused on the task before she looked up at Ethan again. "Do you eat here?" she asked, her voice direct in the way that only came from not knowing there were rules about what to ask. And Ethan paused for a second, not because the question was difficult, but because it required him to answer honestly in a way that did not default to habit. "Not before," he said, his tone even. "But I would like to." And Lila nodded as if that was enough, her attention returning to her plate without further concern. Maya observed the exchange quietly, her gaze moving between them without interrupting, and Ethan felt that awareness, not as pressure, but as presence, a reminder that every word here mattered in a way that could not be undone. He reached for the water, pouring a glass slowly, the simple act grounding him in the moment, and as he set the pitcher back down, he realized something that unsettled him slightly, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was unfamiliar. He was not trying to manage this, not trying to steer it toward a specific outcome. He was just there. "She has a routine," Maya said after a moment, her voice calm, offering information without explanation. "Dinner, then a bath, then a story." And Ethan nodded, absorbing the structure not as instruction, but as insight into a life that had been consistent without him. "What kind of stories?" he asked, his tone quieter now, less formal, more open, and Lila's face lit slightly at the question. "The ones with the girl who builds things," she said, her eyes bright with recognition of something she loved. "She fixes everything." And Ethan felt something shift again, small but steady, as he glanced at Maya briefly before returning his attention to Lila. "That sounds important," he said, and she nodded firmly. "It is," she replied, her certainty simple and complete. Maya allowed the smallest hint of a smile to pass before she reached for her own glass, and the moment settled into something softer, less guarded, not because anything had been resolved, but because something had been allowed. They ate slowly, the conversation moving in small, natural ways, Lila asking questions about things that had no weight beyond her. Curiosity, what kind of car he drove, if he liked dogs, whether he knew how to draw, and Ethan answered each one without rushing, without deflecting, giving her the same attention he would have given a room full of executives, but without the distance, without the layer of control that usually separated him from the moment. At one point, Lila laughed softly at something simple. A small spill of water she quickly wiped up herself, and Ethan found himself watching that too. Not the mistake, but the way she handled it. Calm, unbothered, as if nothing needed to be corrected beyond the moment itself. And he realized that this kind of environment did not revolve around perfection. It revolved around presence. Maya remained mostly quiet, not withdrawn, but observant, allowing the interaction to unfold without stepping in, and Ethan understood that this was not about proving anything. It was about showing up in a way that did not disrupt what already existed. When the meal ended, Lila carried her plate to the sink with practiced ease, her small frame moving with purpose, and Ethan stood as well, instinctively reaching for his own. But he paused, glancing briefly at Maya, not for permission, but for awareness, and she gave a small nod, subtle but clear, and he stepped forward, placing the plate beside Lila's. The action simple, but it carried more meaning than it would have anywhere else. "Can you read tonight?" Lila asked suddenly, turning back toward him with that same directness, and the question hung in the air, not heavy, but significant, because it reached beyond the moment into something that implied continuation. Ethan met her gaze, then looked briefly at Maya, who watched without interruption, her expression neutral but attentive, and he understood that this was not a promise to be made lightly, not a role to step into without thought. "If your mom says it is okay," he replied, his voice steady, placing the decision where it belonged, and Lila looked immediately to Maya, her eyes hopeful but patient, and for a second the room held still again. Maya considered the moment, not the request itself, but what it represented, her gaze moving from her daughter to Ethan and back again, and then she nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. "One story," she said, her tone calm, and Lila's face brightened instantly. The shift in her expression immediate and unfiltered. Ethan felt that too, not as pressure, but as responsibility. And as he followed Lila toward the small corner where a stack of books waited, he understood that this was not about reading words from a page. It was about stepping into a space that had been carefully built without him, and doing it in a way that did not disrupt the foundation already there. He picked up the book she handed him, the cover worn slightly at the edges from use. And as he sat down, Lila settling beside him with quiet anticipation, Maya watching from a short distance away, he opened to the first page. The words simple, the story straightforward, but the moment itself carried something far more complex. Because for the first time, he was not observing from the outside. He was participating, not as someone who owned the outcome, but as someone who was learning, one small, steady moment at a time, how to be present in a life that had never needed him to begin with. The pages turned slowly beneath Ethan's fingers, the soft sound of paper brushing against paper filling the small space between him and Lila, and his voice, steady and measured, carried the story forward in a rhythm that was unfamiliar but grounding. Each word spoken with a level of attention he had never needed to give before, not because the sentences were complex, but because the moment itself required something deeper than efficiency. Lila leaned slightly against his arm as she followed along, her eyes moving across the illustrations, her expression shifting with each part of the story in quiet, genuine ways. A small smile when the girl in the book built something new, a slight furrow of her brow when a problem appeared, and Ethan found himself adjusting his pace to match her reactions, not rushing ahead, not skipping details, allowing the story to unfold at the speed she experienced it. Across the room, Maya remained still, her presence steady but observant, watching not just the scene itself, but the way Ethan handled it, the way he did not try to control the moment or shape it into something it was not. And for the first time since he had entered her life again, there was a subtle shift in the way she held her posture, not relaxed, not fully open, but slightly less guarded, as if something had been acknowledged without needing to be stated. And then she fixed it. Lila whispered softly before Ethan could finish the sentence, her voice carrying quiet excitement. And he paused, glancing down at her with a faint hint of something new in his expression, something lighter, something that did not belong to the world he had come from. "Yes," he said, his tone softer now, because she did not give up on it. And Lila nodded as if that was the most obvious truth in the world, her small hand resting lightly on the edge of the page. When the story ended, Ethan closed the book carefully, not snapping it shut, not placing it aside quickly, but letting the moment settle for a second longer. And Lila looked up at him with quiet satisfaction, the kind that came from something completed, something understood. "You read good," she said simply, and the words, though small, landed with an unexpected weight, because there was no performance in them, no expectation, just a direct acknowledgement, and Ethan felt something shift again, not sharply, not dramatically, but steadily, like a space inside him adjusting to something new. "Thank you," he replied, his voice even, but there was a depth in it now that had not been there before. Maya stepped forward then, her movements calm as she reached for the book, placing it back on the shelf with the same care she had shown in everything else, and she glanced at Lila briefly. "Bath time," she said, her tone gentle but firm, and Lila nodded without protest, sliding off the couch and moving toward the hallway with practiced ease before pausing and looking back at Ethan. "You are coming tomorrow?" she asked, the question simple, but this time it carried a different weight, not just curiosity, but a pattern beginning to form. And Ethan met her gaze, aware now of what even a single word could mean. "If your mom says it is okay," he answered again, maintaining the boundary that had been set, and Lila looked toward Maya, who held her gaze for a second before giving a small, deliberate nod. "We will see," she said, her tone measured, not dismissing the possibility, not confirming it either, and Lila seemed to accept that, turning and disappearing down the hallway with quiet steps. The house settled again into a softer quiet, the distant sound of running water. Beginning as Maya moved toward the kitchen sink, her hands reaching for the plates left behind, and Ethan stood after a moment, not out of obligation, but because remaining seated no longer felt natural. He stepped closer, stopping just short of the counter, his presence noticeable but not intrusive. "I can help," he said, the offer simple, without expectation, and Maya paused briefly, glancing at him before returning her attention to the dish in her hands. "You do not have to," she replied, her tone neutral, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging that without stepping back. "I know," he said, and then, without further comment, he reached for a towel resting nearby, drying the plate she had just rinsed and placing it carefully on the rack, his movements steady, unhurried, not trying to prove anything, just participating in the moment as it existed. Maya watched that for a second, not interrupting, not correcting, and then continued, the rhythm of the task adjusting slightly to include him without changing its structure, and the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with something quieter, something that did not need to be named. After a few minutes, the dishes were done, the kitchen returning to its earlier state of order, and Maya dried her hands, turning slightly to face him fully, her posture composed but attentive. "You understand this does not change everything," she said, her voice calm, not warning, not defensive, just clear, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I know," he replied, and there was no resistance in it, no attempt to push beyond what had been given. "Then why are you here?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a question that required more than surface-level answers, and Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he did not have one, but because he was choosing not to default to the kind of certainty he would have used before. He glanced briefly toward the hallway where Lila had disappeared, then back to Maya, and when he spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that was different from before, less controlled, more grounded. "Because I saw something I cannot ignore," he said, and the simplicity of the statement held more weight than a longer explanation would have. Maya studied him for a moment, her gaze searching for something beyond the words, and then she nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement that he had answered honestly. "Seeing is one thing," she said quietly. "Staying is another." And Ethan inclined his head slightly, understanding the distinction without needing it to be explained further. "Then I will keep showing up," he said, not as a promise that demanded belief, but as a statement that would have to be proven over time. Maya did not respond right away, her eyes holding his for a second longer before shifting toward the window where the night had deepened, the reflection of the room faintly visible in the glass. And when she looked back at him, there was something in her expression that had changed again, not softened, not fully, but less resistant than before, as if a small part of the barrier she had built had been tested and found not to need reinforcement. "We will see," she said again, her tone steady, and this time the words carried less distance, not closing anything, but leaving space for what might come next. And as Ethan stood there, not pushing forward, not stepping back, just present in the moment, he understood that this was not about one night or one decision. It was about every small moment that followed, each one building quietly on the last, until something real could exist where before there had only been absence. The house grew quieter as the night moved forward, the soft sounds of running water fading into silence and the gentle creak of floorboards settling into stillness. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer after Maya's last words, not because he did not understand them, but because he did, and that understanding carried a weight he was not used to carrying without trying to shift it. He glanced once more toward the hallway where Lila had disappeared, the faint echo of her voice, drifting briefly before fading completely. And then he turned back to Maya, who had already begun to move again, wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate motions that spoke more about routine than distraction. "I should go," he said after a moment, his voice steady, not retreating, just acknowledging the natural end of the evening. And Maya nodded once, her expression unchanged but not distant. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, her tone calm, and there was something different in the way she said his name now, not familiar, not softened, but no longer carrying the same distance it had before. He inclined his head slightly in response, then turned toward the door, his steps measured as he moved through the quiet space one last time, aware now of the small details he had noticed earlier, the framed drawings, the bookshelf, the way everything in the house had a place that made sense without needing explanation. And when he stepped outside again, the cool air met him with a clarity that felt sharper than before, as if the world beyond that door had not changed, but his place within it had. The drive back was slower this time, not because of traffic, but because his mind was no longer racing ahead. It was moving in a steady, deliberate way, replaying moments not to analyze them, but to understand them, the way Lila had asked simple questions without hesitation, the way Maya had answered without over-explaining, the way the space between them had shifted without force. And he realized that none of it had been dramatic, none of it had required a grand gesture. It had all unfolded in small, consistent moments, and that made it harder, not easier, because it meant there was no shortcut. When he reached his building, the glass doors reflected him again, but this time he did not pause to look. He moved through them with quiet purpose, the familiar environment greeting him with its usual efficiency. But he did not linger, did not allow himself to settle back into the rhythm that had once defined everything. Instead, he continued up to his office, stepping inside and closing the door behind him with a soft click that marked the shift from one world to another. The city stretched out beyond the windows, lights scattered across the skyline, each one a marker of movement, of activity, of a world that never slowed. And Ethan stood there for a moment, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he looked out, not at the buildings themselves, but at the reflection of something else in the glass, something that had begun to take shape without his permission. His phone buzzed again on the desk, notifications waiting, decisions needing to be made, and he moved toward it, picking it up with practiced ease, scanning through messages, responding where necessary. His actions precise, controlled, the way they always had been. But there was a difference now, subtle but present, a part of him that remained anchored elsewhere, not distracted, just aware. Hours passed, measured in completed tasks and quiet moments of pause. And when he finally left the office, the night had deepened, the city quieter but still moving. And as he drove home, the silence in the car felt less empty, more reflective, as if it held the space for something to settle rather than something to fill. The next morning came with the same structured routine, the same early start, the same sequence of events that had defined his days for years. But when he reached for his schedule, his eyes lingered on it for a fraction longer than usual, not because it was unclear, but because it felt incomplete, and without overthinking it, he made a small adjustment, moving a meeting, clearing a space, not explaining it, just creating it. The day unfolded as expected, conversations, decisions, movement, but each hour brought him closer to something that no longer felt optional. And when the time came, He did not hesitate. He left when he had decided to leave. Not earlier, not later, just as planned. And the drive back to the quiet street felt less like entering something unknown and more like returning to something that had already begun. He parked in the same spot. The familiarity of it no longer strange, and as he stepped out, the evening air carried the same calm as before, the porch light already on, casting its steady glow across the steps. And this time he did not pause at the edge. He walked forward, his steps even, his focus clear, and knocked. The door opened, and Lila stood there again, her expression lighting up in a way that was immediate and genuine, her small frame shifting forward without hesitation. "You came back," she said, but this time there was no question in it, just confirmation, and Ethan felt something settle in that moment, not as relief, but as recognition. "I said I would," he replied, and the words felt different now, not just spoken, but lived. Maya appeared behind her, her gaze moving between them, taking in the exchange with quiet attention, and for a brief moment, there was something in her expression that acknowledged the consistency, not approving it, not welcoming it, but recognizing it for what it was. "We are just finishing homework," she said, stepping aside slightly, and Ethan nodded, stepping inside once more, the space greeting him with the same quiet warmth. But this time it felt less like something he was entering and more like something he was beginning to belong to. Not fully, not yet, but in a way that no longer felt temporary. Lila moved quickly to the table, pointing at a small workbook spread open in front of her, her pencil resting across the page, and Ethan followed, taking a seat beside her without hesitation, his posture relaxed but attentive. And as she explained what she was working on, her voice animated, her focus clear, he listened, not because he needed to understand the task itself, but because he was learning the rhythm of her world, one small moment at a time. And across the room, Maya watched, not interrupting, not guiding, just observing as something new continued to form, not through words, not through promises, but through presence, steady and consistent, the kind that did not demand recognition, but earned it quietly over time. The pencil moved slowly across the page as Lila traced each letter with careful attention, her small fingers gripping it just tightly enough to keep control without pressing too hard. And Ethan sat beside her, leaning slightly forward, his focus fixed not on the workbook itself, but on the way she approached it, the quiet determination in her movements, the way she paused before each line as if considering it fully before committing to the next step. "Is this right?" she asked, turning the page slightly toward him, her voice carrying that same open curiosity that never hesitated. And Ethan looked down, scanning the letters, not with the critical eye he used in contracts or reports, but with a different kind of attention, one that recognized effort before outcome. "You did that carefully," he said, his tone steady, and Lila's shoulders lifted slightly at the acknowledgement, a small shift that showed she understood more than just correctness. She understood being seen. Maya stood a few steps away, her arms loosely crossed as she watched, not stepping in, not correcting, allowing the moment to belong to them, while still holding the space in a way that made it clear she was present. "Can you help me with this one?" Lila asked, pointing to a line she had not started yet, and Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he did not know how to guide her, but because he understood now that even help had to be given carefully here, not taking over, not directing, just supporting. "Show me how you think it should go," he said, and Lila leaned closer, her pencil moving again, slower this time, more deliberate, and he watched without interrupting, only stepping in when she paused, offering a small suggestion that did not replace her effort but built on it. The room settled into a quiet rhythm, the soft scratch of pencil on paper, the occasional shift of a chair, the steady presence of Maya observing without interference. And Ethan realized that this kind of interaction required patience in a way that was different from anything he had experienced before. It was not about reaching an outcome quickly. It was about being present for the process itself. When Lila finished the page, she looked up again, her expression bright with that same quiet pride, and Ethan nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more meaning than any exaggerated praise. "You are getting better," he said, and she smiled. The kind of smile that did not need to be encouraged. It simply appeared when it was earned. "I practice," she replied, her tone matter of fact, and Ethan glanced briefly at Maya, who met his look with a steady gaze that said more than her silence. This was what consistency looked like, not loud, not dramatic, just steady and present over time. The workbook was closed, placed neatly aside, and Lila slid off her chair, moving toward the couch where a small stack of books waited, her energy shifting from focus to something lighter, and Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting loosely in front of him as he took in the room again. Not as an outsider this time, but as someone beginning to understand its rhythm. "She has school tomorrow," Maya said after a moment, her voice calm, not instructing, just informing, and Ethan nodded, the simple statement carrying an entire structure behind it. Mornings, routines, responsibilities that existed without him but now included his awareness. "What time does she leave?" he asked, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to understand the flow of her day, and Maya answered without hesitation. 8:15, she said, and he nodded again, committing the detail to memory in the same way he had done with everything else. But this time it felt different, not like data, but like something he intended to return to. Lila climbed back onto the couch, flipping through one of the books before settling on a page, her attention already shifting to the next part of her evening. And Ethan watched that for a moment before standing slowly, not because he needed to leave, but because he understood that his presence here was still something that had to be measured, not assumed. "I will let you get ready for tomorrow," he said, his tone steady, and Maya nodded once, her gaze steady as she acknowledged the awareness behind his decision. "Good night, Ethan," she said again, and this time there was a slight shift in the way she said it, not warmer, not familiar, but less distant than before, and Ethan inclined his head in response. "Good night, Maya," he replied, then glanced toward Lila, who looked up at him with that same open expression. "Good night," she said, her voice soft but clear, and he allowed a small, genuine smile to touch his expression before turning toward the door. The walk back to his car felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but steady, each step carrying a quiet understanding that this was not something that would be resolved quickly. It would be built, moment by moment, decision by decision. And as he drove away, the streetlights casting soft reflections across the windshield, his mind did not race ahead. It stayed with what had just happened, the small details, the quiet shifts, the way presence had begun to replace absence in a way that did not disrupt what already existed. The next morning came with its usual structure, but there was a difference in the way Ethan moved through it, his attention sharper in some places, quieter in others, and when he glanced at the time, he noted it not just in relation to his own schedule, but to hers, 8:15, and for a moment he found himself imagining the routine, the way she would get ready, the way Maya would guide her through it, and that thought did not feel intrusive, it felt grounding. The day unfolded with its usual demands, meetings, calls, decisions that required clarity and precision, and Ethan handled them with the same level of control he always had. But there was something else now, a layer beneath it that did not fade, a quiet awareness that his time was no longer defined by one world alone. As the afternoon approached, he found himself adjusting his schedule again, not dramatically, not in a way that disrupted everything else, but enough to create space. And when he left the office, it was not with urgency, but with intention, the kind that did not need to be explained because it had already been decided. The drive to the house felt familiar now, the turns no longer uncertain, the street no longer new, and when he parked, he sat for a brief moment, not hesitating, but acknowledging, before stepping out and walking toward the door, the rhythm of his steps steady, grounded in something that was no longer about discovery, but about continuation, and when he knocked, the sound carried the same quiet certainty as before, not asking for entry, but announcing presence, and inside, the life that had always been there continued, now with space for him to step into it again, not as someone who controlled it, but as someone who chose, each time, to be part of it. The door opened before Ethan had the chance to knock a second time, and this time it was Maya who stood there first, her posture steady, her gaze meeting his with a quiet awareness that no longer questioned why he was there, because the answer had already been established through repetition rather than explanation. "You are early," she said, her tone neutral but observant. and Ethan gave a small nod, not apologizing, not over-explaining, just acknowledging the shift. "I had time," he replied. And the simplicity of the statement carried its own meaning, because this was not about having time. It was about choosing where to place it. Maya stepped aside without hesitation, the movement smooth, unforced, and he entered the house again, the now familiar warmth greeting him in a way that no longer felt like an intrusion, but not yet like ownership either, something in between, something that existed because he kept returning. The sound of movement came from down the hallway, light, quick. Steps followed by the soft thud of something being set down, and then Lila appeared, her backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder, her hair slightly uneven as if it had been done in a hurry, and when she saw him, her face brightened immediately in a way that was no longer tentative. "You came before school," she said, her voice carrying a hint of surprise, but not disbelief, and Ethan felt that small shift again. The way her expectation was beginning to form not from promises, but from pattern. "I wanted to see how your morning works," he said, his tone calm, and Lila nodded as if that made perfect sense, her world not complicated enough to question intention beyond what was shown. Maya moved past them toward the kitchen, her hands already reaching for a lunch container on the counter, her movements efficient but not rushed, and Ethan followed at a slight distance, not stepping into her space, but remaining present enough to observe. The kitchen carried a different energy in the morning, brighter, more active, the quiet replaced by the subtle urgency of routine. A glass of orange juice half full, a piece of toast resting on a plate, a small note tucked beside it with neat handwriting that spoke of habit rather than effort. Lila moved to the table, dropping her backpack onto the chair before sitting down, her attention shifting quickly to the food in front of her. And Ethan watched the interaction between her and Maya with a different kind of focus, not analyzing, not comparing, just learning the rhythm of something that had been consistent long before he arrived. "Eat first," Maya said, her tone gentle but firm, and Lila nodded, taking a bite without argument, her movements quick but controlled, and Ethan noticed the balance in that. The way discipline existed without tension, the way structure did not need to be enforced loudly to be followed. He leaned lightly against the counter, his arms resting loosely at his sides, not interfering, not directing, just present, and Maya glanced at him briefly, her gaze assessing not what he was doing, but what he was not doing, and there was a subtle acknowledgement in that, something unspoken that recognized restraint as much as action. "She has a spelling test today," Maya said after a moment, her voice calm, and Ethan nodded, his attention shifting toward Lila. "Are you ready for it?" he asked, and Lila looked up, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "I practiced," she said, her tone confident but not overassured, and Ethan allowed a small nod in response. "That matters," he said, and she smiled slightly, returning to her breakfast with renewed focus. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second moving them closer to the time Maya had mentioned before, 8:15, and Ethan found himself glancing at it without meaning to, not out of impatience, but because he was aligning himself with something that had never included him before. Maya packed the lunch container with practiced precision, sliding it into Lila's bag, checking it once without needing to do so, and then she turned, her gaze moving between Ethan and her daughter. "Shoes," she said simply, and Lila slid off the chair, moving quickly toward the door where a pair of small sneakers waited, the routine flowing without pause. Ethan stepped slightly back, giving space without being asked, his presence adjusted now to fit rather than to lead, and as Lila tied her shoes with careful attention, he noticed again the small details, the independence built into her movements, the way she did not look for help unless she needed it, and that realization carried its own quiet weight. "Ready," she said, standing upright, her backpack now secured properly, and Maya nodded, reaching for her own keys before glancing at Ethan. "We walk," she said, not as an invitation, but as information, and Ethan nodded in return, already understanding what that meant without needing further explanation. They stepped outside together, the morning air cooler, the lights softer than it had been the day before, and the street carried a different energy now, neighbors moving, doors opening, the quiet hum of a day beginning, and Ethan walked beside them, not too close, not distant, his pace naturally adjusting to match theirs. Lila moved slightly ahead, her steps quick but not hurried, occasionally turning back to make sure they were still there, and each time Ethan met her glance with the same steady presence, not calling her back, not directing her forward, just allowing the movement to exist as it was. The school was only a few blocks away, a small building with a playground that already held a few early arrivals. And as they approached, the atmosphere shifted again, voices, laughter, the sound of children beginning their day. And Ethan slowed slightly, aware that this was a space that belonged to her in a different way. Lila stopped near the entrance, turning back toward Maya first, receiving a quick, quiet hug that was routine rather than emotional. And then she looked at Ethan, her expression open, not uncertain, just present. "You are coming later?" she asked, and the question carried a different tone now, less about hope, more about pattern, and Ethan met her gaze, aware of the weight behind even a simple answer. "I will," he said, his voice steady, and Lila nodded once, accepting it without hesitation before turning and walking toward the building, her small figure blending into the movement of the morning. Ethan watched her go for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was uncertain, but because he was beginning to understand what it meant to let someone walk away and still remain present. And when he turned back, Maya was watching him, her gaze steady, measuring something that did not need to be spoken. "You are changing your schedule," she said quietly, not as a question, and Ethan did not deny it. "I am adjusting it," he replied, his tone calm, and she held his gaze for a moment longer before giving a small nod, not approval, not agreement, but acknowledgement. And as they turned to walk back down the quiet street, the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like something being measured carefully, not to keep it apart, but to allow it to grow at a pace that would not break what was already there. The walk back from the school was quieter than before, not because there was nothing to say, but because both of them understood that not every moment needed to be filled with words, and Ethan matched Maya's pace naturally now, no longer adjusting consciously, his steps falling into rhythm beside hers as if repetition had already begun to build something steady between them. The morning lights stretched across the sidewalk, casting long shadows that moved with them, and the neighborhood carried that same calm presence. Doors closing behind parents, cars pulling away, the quiet return to routine after the brief rush of the school drop-off. And Ethan noticed how different this part of the day felt compared to the world he usually operated in. There were no urgent decisions here, no deadlines pressing forward, just a steady unfolding of time that did not need to be managed. Maya walked with her hands loosely at her sides, her posture relaxed but aware, and after a few steps she spoke, her voice even, not breaking the quiet, just moving within it. "She will ask if you are there this afternoon," she said, not as a warning, not as a request, just stating a fact, and Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze forward, understanding the weight behind something so simple. "Then I will be there," he replied, his tone steady, not rushed, not overcommit, just clear, and Maya glanced at him briefly, her expression thoughtful, measuring not the words themselves, but the consistency behind them. "You cannot build something with her on uncertainty," she said, her voice calm but firm, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I am not planning to," he answered, and there was something different in the way he said it now, less like a statement, more like a decision already being lived. They reached the house again, the door opening to the same quiet interior that now felt less unfamiliar, and Maya stepped inside first, moving toward the kitchen with the same steady routine, while Ethan remained near the doorway for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because he understood that this was still her space, something he was stepping into rather than taking part in fully. "You have work," Maya said after a moment, not turning around, her attention on the counter as she began clearing the small remains of the morning, and Ethan nodded once. "I do," he replied, and for a brief second there was a pause, not awkward, not uncertain, just a space where something unspoken existed, and then he continued, "But I will come back before she finishes school," he added, not as a promise for reassurance, but as a continuation of what he had already begun. Maya turned then, her gaze steady, taking in the statement without immediate reaction, and after a second she gave a small nod, not approval, not disbelief, just acknowledgement. "We will be here," she said, and the simplicity of it carried something more than an answer. It carried a quiet acceptance of continuity. Ethan inclined his head slightly, then turned and stepped back outside, the door closing behind him with that same soft, measured sound that no longer felt like separation, but transition. And as he walked back toward his car, there was no pause this time, no need to stand still and process, because the direction had already been set. The drive to his office felt different again, not because the route had changed, but because his attention had shifted. He was no longer moving between two separate worlds. He was carrying both at once, and when he stepped into the building, the familiar structure greeted him with its usual efficiency, but it did not pull him fully back the way it once had. "You are in early," his assistant noted, her tone professional, and Ethan gave a small nod. "Adjust the afternoon," he said simply, his voice calm but decisive, and she paused for a fraction of a second before responding. "Everything?" she asked, and he did not hesitate. "Everything," he confirmed, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not a temporary shift. It was a change in how he was choosing to move forward. The hours that followed were focused, precise, his attention sharp as he moved through tasks, meetings, decisions, but there was a boundary now, a clear line where his work ended for the day, and when that time came, he did not extend it, did not allow one more call or one more discussion to push it further. He stood, gathered what he needed, and left. The drive back carried a different kind of anticipation, not rushed, not anxious, but grounded in the understanding that this was no longer about showing up once. It was about continuing to show up in ways that mattered. When he arrived near the school, he parked along the street, the building already visible ahead, children beginning to gather near the entrance as the afternoon lights softened around them, and Ethan remained in the car for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not hesitating, just acknowledging the moment before stepping into it. He stepped out, the sound of distant voices and movement filling the air, and walked toward the edge of the schoolyard, positioning himself where he could see without intruding, his presence steady, not calling attention to itself. And as the doors opened and children began to stream out, his gaze moved carefully, searching without urgency until it found her. Lila appeared among the others, her backpack slightly askew, her steps quick but controlled as she scanned the area, and then she saw him, her movement pausing for a fraction of a second before shifting, her direction changing without hesitation as she moved toward him, her expression brightening in that same immediate, unfiltered way. "You came," she said again. But this time the words carried something new, not just confirmation, but trust beginning to take shape, and Ethan nodded, his expression steady but softer than before. "I said I would," he replied, and Lila stepped closer, not stopping at a distance now, her small presence settling beside him as if it had always been natural. Maya approached a moment later, her gaze moving between them, taking in the scene with quiet attention, and for a second there was something in her expression that shifted again, not fully, not openly, but enough to show that what had begun as uncertainty was slowly becoming something else, something built not on words, but on repetition, on presence, on the quiet proof of returning exactly when it mattered. "How was your test?" Ethan asked, his tone calm, and Lila looked up at him, her eyes bright. "I knew all of them," she said, her voice carrying quiet pride, and Ethan nodded once, the acknowledgement simple but grounded. "That is because you practiced," he said, and she smiled, the connection between effort and result clear to her in a way that needed no further explanation. They turned then, beginning the walk back together, the three of them moving in a rhythm that no longer felt uncertain, not fully settled, but no longer new. And as the afternoon light stretched across the path ahead, Ethan understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. This was not about stepping into a role. It was about earning a place, one moment at a time, until it no longer felt like something he had to ask for, but something that existed because he had chosen, consistently, to be there. The walk back from the school felt different that afternoon, not because the path had changed, but because something within it had settled into place, and Ethan moved beside Maya and Lila with a steadiness that no longer required adjustment. His pace aligned without effort, his presence no longer something that stood apart from the rhythm of their movement. Lila spoke as they walked, her voice animated as she described her test, the way she had remembered each word, the way her teacher had. Smiled when she finished, and Ethan listened closely, not interrupting, not redirecting, simply allowing her to share the details in the way that mattered to her. And when she paused, he responded with the same quiet attention he had learned to give, not exaggerating, not dismissing, just meeting her where she was. "That means you trusted what you learned," he said, and she nodded quickly, satisfied with that understanding, her small hand briefly swinging closer to his before she moved ahead. Again, her steps light, her energy uncontained but balanced by the steady presence of Maya behind her. Maya watched the exchange without comment, her gaze thoughtful, measuring something deeper than the surface of their conversation. And as they reached the house, she unlocked the door with the same calm efficiency, stepping inside first. Before glancing back briefly, not to invite, but to acknowledge that he was already part of the moment, the house welcomed them with its familiar quiet, the afternoon light filtering through the windows, softer now, settling across the room in a way that made everything feel grounded. And Lila dropped her backpack near the chair before moving toward the table, pulling out her workbook again without being asked, her routine continuing as if his presence had not interrupted it, but had instead become part of it. Ethan took a seat beside her without hesitation, his posture relaxed but attentive, and as she began to show him what she had done earlier, he followed along, his focus steady, not correcting, not leading, just supporting in the way that had begun to define his place in her world. Maya moved through the kitchen quietly, preparing a small snack, her movements measured, and every now and then her gaze would shift toward them, not intruding, not guiding, just observing the continuity of something that was no longer unfamiliar. Time passed in small, steady moments, homework reviewed, a snack shared, a few questions asked and answered without urgency, and Ethan remained present through all of it, not checking his phone, not dividing his attention, just there in a way that did not feel temporary. As the afternoon moved closer to evening, the light outside dimming gradually, Lila closed her workbook and leaned back slightly, her energy shifting from focus to something lighter again, and she looked at Ethan with that same directness that had never faded. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked, and the question carried a different weight now, not just curiosity, but expectation shaped by consistency, and Ethan glanced briefly at Maya, not for permission, but for awareness, understanding that this decision did not belong to him alone. Maya met his gaze, her expression steady, and for a moment the room held that quiet pause where something unspoken passed between them, and then she gave a small nod, deliberate and calm. "You can stay," she said, and the simplicity of the words carried more than an invitation. It carried a shift, small but undeniable, and Ethan inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, not overstating it, not reacting beyond what the moment required. "Thank you," he said, his tone even, but there was a depth to it now that had not been there before. Lila smiled, her attention already shifting to the next part of her routine, and Maya turned back toward the kitchen, the rhythm of preparation beginning again, but this time it included him without needing to be adjusted. Ethan stood after a moment, moving toward the counter, not waiting to be asked, not assuming control, simply stepping into the space with quiet intention, and he reached for the items Maya had set out, handing them to her as needed, his movements aligning with hers without interruption, without overstepping, and for the first time, the silence between them felt different, not measured, not guarded, but balanced. "You do not have to prove anything," Maya said after a moment, her voice calm, her attention still on what she was doing, and Ethan paused slightly, considering the words before responding. "I am not trying to prove anything," he said, his tone steady, and when she glanced at him, there was something in his expression that reflected that. Truth, not defensive, not persuasive, just clear. "Then what are you doing?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a question that had been forming quietly beneath everything else. Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing not to respond with the kind of certainty he would have used before, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same grounded steadiness he had begun to understand. "I am staying," he said simply, and the words, though quiet, carried a weight that did not need to be expanded, because they were already being lived. Maya held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression thoughtful, and then she nodded once, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging that what mattered now would not be decided in a single moment, but over time. Dinner unfolded in the same steady rhythm as before, conversation moving naturally, Lila sharing small details of her day, Ethan listening and responding without interruption, Maya present, but not directing. And as the evening settled, the house held a different kind of quiet, one that no longer felt like it belonged to two people alone, but to something that was slowly expanding. After the meal, Lila brought out her book again, her expectation clear without needing to be stated, and Ethan took it from her with a small nod, settling into the familiar space beside her, his voice carrying the story forward in that same steady rhythm, the pages turning, the moments unfolding, and across the room, Maya watched, her posture no longer as guarded as it had been at the beginning, not fully open, but no longer closed, because what she was seeing was not a performance, it was consistency, and consistency did not need to be forced, it revealed itself over time. When the story ended and Lila leaned against him briefly before standing, her small voice soft as she said, "Good night." The moment lingered just long enough to be felt before she disappeared down the hallway, and the house settled again into its evening quiet. Ethan remained where he was for a moment, the book still in his hands, before closing it gently and placing it aside, his gaze lifting to meet Maya's. And in that look there was no question, no request, just an understanding that something had shifted, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to change what came next. Maya held his gaze, her expression calm, and after a moment she spoke, her voice steady, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this point. "This is not easy," she said, not as a warning, but as a truth, and Ethan nodded once. "I know," he replied, and for the first time, that acknowledgement did not come from assumption, it came from experience. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of what had been built, moment by moment, decision by decision, and as Ethan stood there, not rushing to leave, not trying to stay beyond what was given, he understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. This was not about earning forgiveness or claiming a place. It was about showing up, again and again, until the space he occupied was no longer questioned, but simply understood as part of what had always been there, waiting to be recognized.